Mystery in the Mountains. The Truth About the Donner Party 1846. On January 12, 1847, a piercing cry echoed through the Sierra Nevada mountains through the biting morning frost. Jagged peaks cast long shadows over a small village where a terrified boy, wrapped in animal pelts, stumbled out of the dense forest, his face contorted with fear, his lungs heaving as he gestured wildly toward the darkness between the trees. Before we delve into this haunting tale of survival, make sure to subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories and activate notifications. Join our community as we explore the forgotten chapters of America's frontier history. Along the ice-crusted stream, women worked steadily, crushing acorns between weathered stones, while children collected kindling for the night's fires. The steady thump of mortar blended with soft murmurs and easy banter. Downstream, fishermen cast their lines into the frigid waters, their movements born of generations of practice. Whispers of smoke drifted skyward from bark-thatched shelters, carrying the aroma of burning pine and baked meals into the crystalline mountain air. But this tranquil scene was destined for disruption. As the village warriors reached for their obsidian arrows and flint blades, 7 shapes materialized from the forest depths. They moved like you spooky spirits of the dead. The Maidu whispered, souls condemned to eternal wandering. Their emaciated bodies hung with decaying rags, flesh shrunk tight against jutting bones. Feeble eyes peered from sunken faces, glazed with ice and filth. Frozen droplets of blood marked their wavering path. These weren't spirits, though. They bordered on the ethereal. The 7 survivors, 2 men and 5 women, swayed on unsteady legs, their shredded garments barely holding together. Provided no shield from the mountain's fury, frost-bitten fingers stretched outward in silent plea, as strange words spilled from their split and bleeding mouths. The village healer, the Oi, was called forth immediately. As he studied these walking wraiths, even his seasoned gaze registered disbelief. These were white travelers, yes, but what nightmares had transformed them into such hollow shells? What mountain demons had stripped away their humanity, leaving only these desperate shadows? The Maidu, their hearts moved by mercy, welcomed them without question. They had no way of knowing the unspeakable acts these survivors had performed to reach their village. No way of knowing that these 7 were the remnants of 17 who had embarked weeks before. And no way of knowing that the crimson stains on their clothing told a story far darker than simple survival. This is the saga of the forlorn hope, a chronicle of desperation, endurance, and the devastating choices humans make when pushed beyond their breaking point. But deeper still, it's a narrative of prejudice, betrayal, and the bitter truth that salvation sometimes comes too late. What forces drove these souls to such extremes? What fate befell those who vanished along the way? The answers await in a trail of bloodied footprints, winding back into the merciless heart of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The October sun cast long shadows across the Salt Lake Desert as 15 wagons carved their path westward. 80 dreamers moved like a living tapestry across the barren landscape, mothers cradling infants wrapped in hand-sewn quilts, fathers scanning the horizon with weary determination, children chasing tumbleweeds between creaking wheels. Maps spread across wagon seats showed California as a promised land of endless opportunity. Sarah Foster pressed a dried flower between the pages of her journal, imagining gardens that would bloom year-round in their new home. Behind her, James Reed's wagon carried a polished writing desk, a symbol of the civilized life they hoped to build in the West. The wagon train moved like a slow-motion dance, wheels rising and falling over sun-baked earth, oxen swaying in their yokes, women gathering dried buffalo chips for evening fires. 6 months of travel had taught them its rhythm. The morning bustle of breaking camp, the long hours of walking, the evening ritual of circling wagons. Their bodies bore witness to the journey's toll. Sunburned faces, cracked hands, clothes patched and repatched. Then came the letter that would seal their fate. Ransford Hastings, a name whispered around campfires like a promise, had blazed a new trail 40 days shorter. The letter claimed, its creased pages passing from hand to hand, a straight shot through to California. The words sparked hope in tired eyes, drowning out the quiet voice of caution. The shortcut became their undoing. Wagon wheels splintered against unseen rocks. In the Wasatch Range, axes rang against granite as they carved a path where none existed. Each mile claimed its price. Broken axles, abandoned furniture, precious water barrels running dry. The desert stretched before them like a furnace, each step drawing them deeper into its deadly embrace. Time slipped away like water through their fingers. What should have been a 40-day saving became a 6-week delay. October winds carried the scent of snow from distant peaks. While their supplies dwindled with each passing sunset, salvation arrived with a jingling of mule bells. Charles Stanton emerged from the desert haze, leading 7 laden mules, and to figures whose presence would change everything. Louis and Salvador moved like shadows across the landscape, their moccasined feet leaving barely a trace in the desert sand. The 2 Maoic guides carried their missionary, given names like borrowed clothes. Louis, whose true name was Quingen, stood tall at 28, his eyes holding the quiet wisdom of mountain trails and hidden springs. Salvador, born Emma, was younger at 19, but his hands already bore the calluses of a lifetime, reading the land's secret language. They worked in seamless tandem, Salvador reading weather patterns and morning clouds, Louis identifying safe camping spots with a glance. Their knowledge wasn't learned from books, but absorbed through generations of tribal wisdom. Each evening they would withdraw to their own fire, speaking softly in Miwok, their silhouettes merging with the gathering darkness. The emigrants watched them with mixed emotions. Some saw angels of mercy, sent by John Sutter himself to guide them to safety. Others muttered behind raised hands, questioning whether these savages could be trusted. Yet none could deny their skill as they led the wagon train through hidden valleys and along ancient tribal paths. But even their expertise couldn't overcome nature's timeline. The Sierra Nevada stood before them like a wall of stone and ice, its peaks already wearing winter's white mantle. Louis and Salvador exchanged increasingly troubled glances as they studied the mountain passes. Their people had crossed these ranges for countless generations, but never this late in the season. Each attempt to cross the mountains ended the same way. The guides would lead them up promising valleys, only to be driven back by howling winds and blinding snow. The party retreated to a lake where abandoned cabins offered temporary shelter. There, they watched helplessly as winter sealed their fate, turning familiar trails into deadly traps of ice and snow. The mountains that Louis and Salvador knew, like their own heartbeats, had become an impassable barrier, and the worst of their journey was still to come. Winter's siege of Truckee Lake intensified with each passing day. The shoreline bristled with makeshift shelters, abandoned cabins claimed by the fortunate, hastily built lean to sway in the bitter wind, and canvas tents buckling under mounting snow. Each morning, fresh powder sealed them further from the world beyond, turning their sanctuary into a frozen vault. The double cabin, largest among the structures, stood as a monument to desperate cooperation. Within its rough-hewn walls, 2 families struggled to maintain the facade of civility while watching their supplies diminish. Every cough echoed through the confined space. Every whispered conversation carried undertones of fear. Children huddled together for warmth, their thin frames shivering despite layers of threadbare blankets. Footprints in the snow mapped out their shrinking world. A narrow path led to the lake, where fishing holes quickly froze over. Another trail snaked into the timber, where the search for firewood became more desperate each day. Between the shelters, people moved like ghosts, heads down against the wind, clutching whatever meager supplies they had managed to gather. Trust evaporated faster than their cooking fires. Food stores were counted morning and night, marked with secret symbols in the snow. When resources were shared, every eye watched the division, measuring, comparing, judging. Children learned to sleep, curled around their families' food bags, their dreams haunted by gnawing hunger. Through this atmosphere of growing desperation, Louis and Salvador wove their daily patterns. Dawn found them already moving through the forest, their moccasined feet leaving barely a trace in the fresh snow. Their knowledge of winter survival ran deep in their Mi'ewak blood. Which trees still held dry wood in their cores, where bark could sustain life, where small game might still be found. Yet when they offered this wisdom, the settlers turned away, pride still stronger than hunger's bite. Their status in the camp remained that of outsiders. Despite their labor in building the double cabin, they claimed only its darkest corner, sleeping on the dirt floor with scanty blankets. During meals they ate apart from the others, feeling the weight of distrustful glances. Their attempts to communicate vital survival skills met walls of prejudice and disdain. Only Stanton bridged the divide, but his voice grew weaker as provisions dwindled. The camp's food supplies vanished with terrifying speed. The oxen fell first, their slaughter a desperate ceremony. Nothing was wasted blood-drunk, still warm meat carefully portioned. Hides preserved until hunger demanded their sacrifice. Bones were cracked for marrow, then boiled until the broth ran clear. Still they boiled them, hoping to extract one more meal from the ghostly remnants. Horses and mules followed their flesh, sustaining the group for precious days. The camp's dogs disappeared one by one, their fate marked by averted eyes and grateful. Guilty meals' leather became sustenance. Boots, belts, harnesses all transformed into tough, barely digestible soup. Each day brought new definitions of what could be considered food. Hope arrived in an unexpected form. Franklin Graves, drawing on his Vermont experience, fashioned crude snowshoes from oxbows and leather strips. His announcement electrified the camp. Strong legs could reach Sutter's Fort in 6 days. Bring back rescue before it's too late. The debate was fierce but brief. 17 volunteers came forward. 11 men, 5 women. 1 child. Louis and Salvador would lead. Their previously scorned expertise, now valuable as gold. Stanton, despite failing vision, joined without hesitation. Their provisions were pathetically inadequate. 6 days of starvation rations, dried meat strips, mere handfuls of cornmeal. As they tested the makeshift snowshoes, grim understanding passed between them. 6 days. Food could never fuel a 90-mile mountain crossing. The rescue party faced a brutal choice. Swift success or decisions too horrible to voice, yet staying meant certain death for all. Tomorrow they would venture into the white wilderness, carrying not just their meager supplies, but the fate of the entire camp on their shoulders. Dawn broke over Truckee Lake on December 16, 1846, revealing 17 figures testing their makeshift snowshoes. In the crystalline air, the crude devices fashioned from oxbows and rawhide groaned beneath their weight as they made final adjustments at the front. Louis and Salvador surveyed the terrain with inherited wisdom, their movements fluid and certain against the settlers' clumsy steps. They stood ready for departure. 11 men, 5 women, and a child, each clutching pathetically small bundles of provisions. 6 days' rations seemed impossibly meager for the 90-mile journey ahead. Tough strips of desiccated ox flesh, precious spoonfuls of cornmeal that would barely sustain life. Steam rose from their lips as they embraced those remaining behind, each farewell heavy with unspoken fears. The initial departure from the lake carried equal measures of terror and determination. Louis and Salvador took point, generations of tribal knowledge guiding their path through the treacherous terrain. The settlers followed, laboriously struggling with unfamiliar snowshoes, while battling deep drifts and merciless cold. Mountain winds sliced through their inadequate clothing like knives of ice, while the altitude left them gasping for breath. Progress was painfully slow, each step forward a victory against nature, each mile gained at the cost of desperately needed energy. The sun's reflection off endless snow threatened to blind them, turning the white landscape into a dazzling torture. Charles Stanton showed signs of weakness from the first day, though only 35. His body bore the weight of 2 recent mountain crossings, each journey stripping away vital reserves of strength. His eyes, already failing, squinted painfully against the snow's brilliant glare. December 18th marked the beginning of Stanton's decline. He began lagging behind the group, appearing at their camps hours after the others had arrived. Each day the delays grew longer, his movements more labored. On December 20th, they found him resting on a fallen pine, his hands shaking as he reached for his tobacco pouch. "Move ahead," he murmured, voice barely audible above the mountain whines. "I'll be along shortly." Louis and Salvador recognized the resignation in his eyes, the look of a man who had made his final decision. They watched silently as he packed his pipe with deliberate care, his acceptance of fate evident in every measured gesture. The party pressed onward, but every ridge became an observation post, eyes strained through swirling snow. Searching for Stanton's familiar silhouette. On the trail behind them, he never appeared. Spring would come and go before his body was discovered, still seated on his chosen resting place. Frozen fingers still wrapped around his faithful pipe. His loss cast deep shadows over the group's morale. Stanton had been their bridge to the outside world, the one who had brought both supplies and guides from Sutter's Fort. Without his steady presence, their tenuous grasp on hope began to slip. Winter storms intensified, obscuring trails and forcing them into dead ends that wasted precious time and strength. Christmas Eve brought nature's fury in full force. The remaining 16 huddled around a dying fire as Antonio, the Mexican teamster, silently surrendered to the cold. They moved his body from their circle mechanically, already numb to death's presence. When fierce winds extinguished their fire, they pressed together beneath makeshift blanket shelters, depending on shared body heat and gathering snow for survival. Franklin Graves succumbed next, his 57 years weighing too heavily against the mountain's challenges. As life ebbed away, he gathered his daughter's clothes, whispering a terrible request through cracked lips, begging them to use his flesh for survival after death claimed him. Morning revealed his body among 3 others in the snow. Patrick Doolan's death came with haunting strangeness. Rising suddenly from their shelter, he began shedding clothes, smiling serenely as he proclaimed his warmth. Too weak to prevent his actions, the group watched helplessly as he wandered into the storm. His return brought only brief relief. Death claimed him soon after. Young Lemuel Murphy followed before dawn, his small frame finally surrendering to winter's embrace. The following day brought clearing skies and humanity's darkest hour. 36 hours had passed without food, for bodies lay preserved in the snow, while Doolan's earlier suggestion about drawing lots for sacrifice haunted their thoughts. With tears freezing on their cheeks, they began the unthinkable task of preparing the dead for consumption. Louis and Salvador stood apart, their ancient cultural beliefs preventing participation in this desperate act. Miwok tradition forbade not only cannibalism, but even the consumption of bears, fearing the animals might have eaten human flesh. While others cut and wept, the 2 guides maintained their distance, their physical hunger dwarfed by spiritual revulsion. The aftermath of that first ghastly meal brought subtle but dangerous changes. William Foster, watching his beloved Sarah grow weaker, began viewing Louis and Salvador with predatory calculation. His whispered proposition to kill the Miwoks for food spread through the group like frostbite. The guides sensed the shift, immediately noticed the averted gazes, the furtive glances, the way Foster's hand kept straying to his weapon as December 30th twilight painted the mountains in shades of purple and gray. Louis and Salvador huddled near their separate campfire. They had chosen to distance themselves from the main group, their instincts warning them of growing danger. The wind carried fragments of hushed conversations from the other camp, words they could no longer trust. A shadow moved through the gathering darkness, causing both men to tense. They gripped crude wooden sticks, their only defense, before recognizing William Eddy's approaching figure. He had been the lone member besides themselves who had initially refused the desperate turn to cannibalism, though starvation had eventually worn down his resistance. Eddy moved with careful deliberation, his hollow face ghostly in the fading light. Wrestling against the language barrier, through a combination of gestures and simple words, he conveyed his terrifying warning. Foster had convinced the others that killing the Miwoks for food was their only chance for survival. The same desperate arithmetic that had justified consuming the dead now targeted the living. Louis and Salvador absorbed this news in heavy silence, doubt flickering across their exhausted faces. They had sensed the shift in atmosphere, caught the predatory glances, noticed Foster's increasingly obvious attention to his weapon. Still, some part of them resisted, believing that those they had struggled to help would turn against them with such calculated cruelty. Yet Eddy's frantic sincerity could not be dismissed. The threat transcended any difficulties of translation. Death stalked them now in human form. As night claimed the mountain, the 2 Miwoks reached their decision. They would slip away in darkness, trusting their ancestral knowledge of these peaks to guide them to safety. They pushed through the night, leaving crimson footprints in their wake. 9 days passed without sustenance, each step draining their dwindling reserves. Though civilization might have been near, their bodies were failing. They resorted to foraging along a creek bed, searching for the acorns and grubs that sustained their ancestors through countless winters. The crunch of approaching footsteps found them, collapsed in the snow, too weak to flee. 7 gaunt figures, all that remained of the group they had guided, passed by without acknowledgement. Louis and Salvador lay still, perhaps daring to hope the danger had passed. Foster's return shattered that hope. He stood alone, flintlock ready. They could only watch, too exhausted for resistance or escape. Louis lifted his head at the weapon's click, perhaps still unable to grasp this final treachery. The shot echoed across the wilderness, leaving him motionless in the gathering snow. Salvador stretched toward his fallen friend, a last futile gesture of solidarity. The second shot ended his reaching forever. Foster worked with practiced efficiency, preparing their bodies as he had learned in weeks of desperate survival. The others returned, and together, they consumed the flesh of men who had tried to save them. 7 figures emerged from the wilderness on that January morning, their appearance shocking the peaceful Maitu village. The natives' immediate compassion, offering food, warmth, and shelter, stood in stark contrast to the bloody deeds that had marked the survivors' journey. These same hands that now accepted bowls of healing soup had just days before taken the lives of those who tried to save them. The survivors' stories spread quickly through the settlements. At Johnson's ranch, where they finally found proper medical care, careful omissions marked their retelling. The fate of Louis and Salvador remained obscure behind vague explanations and averted eyes. Some claimed the Miwoks had already been dead when found. Others suggested they had been near death anyway, their sacrifice inevitable. William Foster's role in the tragedy underwent a dramatic transformation. In public narrative, his killing of Louis and Salvador, rather than being questioned, became celebrated as an act of necessity. The prevailing attitudes of the time painted him not as a murderer but as a hero. A man who had made the hard choice, needed to save his wife and companions. The 1879 publication of C.F. McLuhan's History of the Donner Party crystallized this perspective. His words dripped with justification. Was it murder? No. Every law book, every precept of that higher law, self-preservation, demanded the deed. The Indians were past all hope of aid. They could not lift their heads from their pillow of snow. It was not simply justifiable. It was duty. These words revealed more than just M.C. Lackland's view of the events. They laid bare the deep-seated prejudices of the era, where the lives of 2 Native Americans weighed little against white survival. The same society that recoiled in horror at the consumption of white settlers found ways to rationalize and even praise the murder of indigenous guides. For the survivors, life continued with the weight of their choices. Foster and Eddie, despite their opposing roles in the fate of Louis and Salvador, found themselves working together in subsequent rescue efforts. They joined parties heading back to Truckee Lake, pushing through the same brutal conditions that had claimed so many lives. Their shared experiences bound them together, even as the memories haunted their nights. Yet the psychological toll proved impossible to escape. Many survivors reported recurring nightmares, their sleep broken by visions of snow-covered mountains and the faces of those they had lost or consumed. Some turned to alcohol, others to religion, seeking ways to cope with memories too heavy to bear. Sarah Foster, for whose survival her husband had killed, lived with that knowledge until her death. William Eddie carried the burden of his failed warning, his nights haunted by thoughts of what might have been, if Louis and Salvador had fled sooner, or if he had found some way to protect them. The true tragedy lay not just in the deaths of Louis and Salvador, but in how easily society dismissed them. 2 men who had left their tribe to help strangers, who had shared their generations of knowledge, who had worked tirelessly to guide others to safety, were reduced to mere statistics. Their deaths, justified by the convenience of racial prejudice, their story stands as a dark reminder of humanity's capacity for both compassion and cruelty. In the isolated peaks of the Sierra Nevada, these opposing forces played out their deadly dance. The Maidou's immediate acceptance of the survivors demonstrated one path Foster's bullets showed another. Between these extremes lay the complicated truth of human nature, pushed to its limits. The mountains where Lewis and Salvador died still stand indifferent to the dramas that unfolded in their shadows. Their slopes hold no markers for the two Milwaukee guides, no monuments to their sacrifice, yet their story demands remembrance, not just as victims of desperate circumstances, but as men who upheld their principles until the end, who refused to participate in acts their culture deemed unthinkable, and who paid the ultimate price for their conviction. If you're moved by stories that reveal the complex layers of American history, subscribe to Native Legends and History. Stories help us preserve and share these crucial narratives that shaped our past.